The grand throne room of the Celtharian dominion was filled with tension. Tall, elegant alien nobles stood in rows, their blue-skinned faces unreadable. At the center, King Valor, ruler of the empire, sat on his towering golden throne. His piercing gaze swept across the chamber as he prepared to announce a decree that would shake the very foundation of his kingdom. The three princesses, Tyra, Velia, and Lurian, stood before their father, their expressions varying from curiosity to shock. The eldest was a proud warrior, her body adorned with ceremonial armor. Velia, the middle sister, was calm and analytical, always thinking before speaking. Lurian, the youngest, was soft-spoken, her silver eyes filled with uncertainty. "I have made my decision," the king declared, his deep voice echoing through the hall. "To strengthen our empire and secure our alliance with humanity, one of my daughters must marry a human." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Thyra's fists clenched. "Father, this is madness. Humans are weak. They do not belong in our royal bloodline." Velia tilted her head, considering the king's words carefully. Are they truly weak, or do they possess strengths we have yet to understand? Lurian remained silent, her expression unreadable. The nobles protested loudly. The idea of an alien princess marrying the human was unthinkable. Humans were outsiders, barely considered worthy of intergalactic politics, let alone royal bloodlines. But King Valor was resolute. "The decision is final," he said, raising a hand for silence. "We have fought wars for centuries. The humans have proven their resilience, their ingenuity. We must not underestimate them. This union will unite our worlds." Meanwhile, far away on Earth, Darren Cole, an ex-soldier turned space explorer, received an unexpected message from the intergalactic embassy. His ship had been requested for a diplomatic mission. He had no idea that he was about to be caught in the middle of a royal decree that would change his life forever. Back in the Celtharian capital, the princesses faced their father. Thyra was seething. "I refuse," she said. "No human is worthy of standing beside me." Velia sighed. "If this is a test of logic, I will observe and decide accordingly." Lurian, still quiet, finally spoke. "What if the human is not what we expect?" King Valor smiled, as if he had already seen the future. "Then let him prove himself." And with that, the fate of a human and 3 alien princesses was sealed. Darren Cole sat in the cockpit of his small exploration ship, the Starbound Eagle, staring at the strange message on his screen. "By order of King Valor of the Celtharian Dominion, you are requested for an urgent diplomatic mission. Refusal is not an option." Darren frowned. The Celtharians were powerful, and their king's orders were law. But why him? He was just an explorer, a former soldier trying to escape war. Whatever this was, it sounded serious. Moments later, his ship's auto-navigation system was overridden. The controls locked, and a new course was set. Darren's stomach tightened as he realized he had no choice. He was being taken straight to the Celtharian homeworld. The Celtharian capital was unlike anything Darren had ever seen. Towering crystal-like buildings reflected the twin suns above, and the air hummed with energy from floating transport ships. The streets were filled with tall, blue-skinned aliens, their regal attire marking their noble heritage. Darren was led into the grand throne hall, where dozens of nobles whispered and sneered at him. He didn't need to understand their language to know what they thought. A human. Disgusting. Surely this is a joke. No human is fit to stand before our king. Darren ignored them, keeping his posture straight. He had been through worse. At the top of the grand stairs, 3 alien princesses stood beside the king. The first one, Tyra, looked furious. Her arms were crossed, her sharp golden eyes filled with anger and disgust. The second, Velia, studied Darren carefully, like a scientist analyzing an experiment. The third, Lurian, seemed unsure, avoiding his gaze. King Valor rose from his throne. "Human," he said, his deep voice powerful, "you have been chosen for a great honor. One of my daughters will become your wife." Silence filled the room. Darren blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Zyra scoffed. "I will never marry a human." Velia spoke in a calm tone. "That depends on whether he is worthy." Lyrian's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Darren shook his head. "I think there's been a mistake. I didn't sign up for this." The king's gaze hardened. "It is not a request. This union is necessary for peace." Darren exhaled slowly. He was a fighter, not a politician. But he wasn't stupid either. If he refused, things could get very bad for him. King Valor continued, "You must prove yourself through the trials of honor. Only if you pass will my daughters accept you. Fail, and you will return to Earth in shame." Darren's jaw tightened. He hated being forced into things, but backing down wasn't an option. He met the king's gaze and smirked. "Fine, I'll play your game." From the corner of his eye, he noticed Lyrian watching him differently now. And so, the trials of honor began. Darren stood in the center of the royal training grounds, surrounded by towering Seltharian warriors. Their sharp gazes burned into him, filled with doubt and amusement. The trials of honor had officially begun. King Valor sat on his golden throne, watching from a high balcony. The three princesses stood beside him. Thyra smirked, arms crossed, expecting him to fail. Velia observed with quiet curiosity. Lyrian looked nervous, her fingers gripping the edges of her royal cloak. A massive Seltharian warrior, easily twice Darren's size, stepped forward. His dark blue skin gleamed under the twin suns. He pounded his chest. "I am Commander Zorak, champion of the Royal Guard," he declared. "Your first trial is combat. Show us if you are worthy of standing beside our princesses." Darren rolled his shoulders, keeping his expression calm. He had fought in battles before, but this was different. The Seltharians were stronger, faster, and trained in ways he had never seen. Zorak lunged at him without warning. Darren barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as a massive fist nearly crushed his ribs. He jumped back, calculating. If he tried to fight with brute strength, he would lose instantly. He had to be smart. The warrior charged again. This time, Darren sidestepped at the last moment, using Zorak's momentum against him. The giant alien stumbled forward, surprised. The crowd murmured. Zyra scoffed. That was luck. Velia tilted her head. No, that was strategy. Zorak growled, then drew a massive energy blade from his back. The weapon hummed with power. Darren had no weapon. The warrior swung. Darren ducked just in time. He grabbed a handful of sand from the ground and threw it into Zorak's eyes. Blinded, the warrior roared in frustration. Darren took his chance. He leaped onto Zorak's back, wrapped his arms around the warrior's thick neck and squeezed. The crowd gasped. Zorak struggled, trying to throw Darren off. But Darren held on tight, using every ounce of his strength. The warrior stumbled, then finally collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Darren let go and stepped back. Silence. Then, to everyone's shock, Zorak pounded his fist against his chest and bowed. "I yield," the warrior admitted. The human fights with intelligence. The crowd erupted into mixed reactions. Some cheered. Some sneered. On the balcony, Lyrian's lips curled into a small smile. Velia gave an approving nod. Zyra, however, looked irritated. King Valor rose. "Impressive. You passed the first trial." Darren exhaled, sweat dripping down his face. That was only the beginning. The king's voice boomed. "Prepare for the next trial. Let us see if you can survive what comes next." Darren stood in the training grounds, still catching his breath. The first trial was over, but he knew this was only the beginning. King Valor watched from his high throne. "You have proven your skill in combat," he announced. "But strength alone is not enough. A ruler's consort must also have intelligence and survival instincts. Velia raised an eyebrow. This next trial should be interesting. Thyra scoffed. He just got lucky last time. Let's see him survive this one. Lyrian remained silent, but her silver eyes were filled with quiet concern. A massive door at the edge of the arena opened, revealing a dark tunnel. The king gestured toward it. The second trial is the trial of survival. You will be placed in the Forbidden Wilds, a jungle filled with dangerous creatures. You must survive until sunrise. Darren frowned. That's it. Just survive. A deep chuckle came from one of the nearby nobles. Many warriors enter the Forbidden Wilds, he sneered. Few return. Darren sighed. Great. Without another word, 2 Zeltharian guards led him toward the entrance. As he stepped inside, the heavy door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in complete darkness. The Forbidden Wilds were nothing like the forests of Earth. The trees were twisted and massive, their glowing vines pulsing with an eerie blue light. Strange alien creatures rustled in the underbrush, their glowing eyes watching him. Darren moved cautiously. He had survived in dangerous places before, but this was completely different. A distant snarl made him freeze. Something was out there. Something big. Then he heard footsteps, not from a creature, but from someone following him. His instincts screamed danger. Suddenly, a sharp dart flew past his face, missing him by inches. Darren spun around just in time to see 2 cloaked figures emerging from the shadows. Assassins. Seriously, Darren muttered. I knew this was rigged. The assassins lunged. Darren dodged the first attack, barely avoiding a poisoned blade. He grabbed a nearby thick branch and swung it like a club, knocking one assassin back. The second attacker charged, but Darren used his combat training, twisting the assassin's arm and throwing him into a tree. The enemy hit the trunk with a painful crack and collapsed. Panting, Darren looked down at the attackers. These weren't wild animals. Someone had sent them to kill him. Meanwhile, back in the palace, Lyrian gasped as she overheard a noble whispering in the halls. The human must not survive. Make sure he never leaves the Forbidden Wilds alive. Her heart pounded. Someone was trying to sabotage Darren's trials. Without thinking, Lyrian turned and ran to find her father. Darren might not know it yet, but he was in more danger than he realized. Darren crouched low, his breathing steady as he examined the unconscious assassins. Their armor bore no royal insignia, which meant they weren't soldiers. Hired killers. Someone didn't want him to survive this trial. He searched their belts and found a small communicator. Before he could activate it, a low growl echoed through the jungle. Darren looked up and saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring at him from the shadows. A Predathar beast. The massive creature stepped forward, its black fur blending with the darkness. Razor-sharp claws gleamed in the moonlight. Its breath was heavy, like a monster ready to pounce. Darren took a slow step back. Fighting an assassin was one thing. Fighting this thing was suicide. The beast roared and charged. Darren dived to the side, rolling across the dirt as claws slashed inches from his chest. He grabbed a nearby sharp rock and threw it at the creature's eye. The rock hit its mark. The beast howled in pain, thrashing wildly. Darren didn't wait. He ran. Through the dense jungle, over twisted roots, past glowing plants. The beast was still behind him, its thundering footsteps shaking the ground. Then Darren saw it, a steep cliff edge ahead. No time to stop. At the last second, he leaped. He barely managed to grab onto a hanging vine, swinging over the edge as the Predathar beast skidded to a stop behind him, growling in frustration. Darren climbed up a rocky ledge and collapsed against a tree, breathing hard. He had survived. But the assassins worried him more than the beast. Someone wanted him dead. Meanwhile, in the palace, Lyrian ran through the royal corridors, her heart pounding. She had overheard the nobles talking about Darren's assassination. She reached her father's chamber and burst in. "Father, someone is trying to sabotage the trials." Kane Vaylor looked at her, calm but intrigued. Explain. She hesitated, realizing she had no proof, only what she had overheard. But she couldn't ignore it. Someone sent assassins to kill Darren, she said. This is not a fair trial. Someone in the court wants him to fail. Zyra scoffed from the side. Or maybe he just isn't strong enough to survive. Velia, ever the logical one, narrowed her eyes. If what Lyrian says is true, then this is not just about Darren. Someone is opposing the king's decree. The king considered this, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his throne. If the human survives the trial, we will investigate. Lyrian clenched her fists. But what if he doesn't? Darren tightened his grip on the makeshift spear he had crafted from a sharpened branch. The jungle was full of dangers, and after the assassination attempt, he wasn't taking any chances. Then, from the shadows, Lyrian stepped forward. He lowered his weapon in surprise. "What are you doing here?" She looked nervous but determined. "You are in danger. Someone in the court doesn't want you to survive the trials." Darren sighed. "Yeah, I figured that out when they sent assassins after me." Lyrian hesitated. "I shouldn't be here. If anyone finds out, it could cause a scandal." Darren studied her face. Unlike her sisters, Lyrian didn't treat him like an enemy or an outsider. She was worried about him. "Then why did you come?" he asked. She hesitated before whispering, "Because I want you to win." Darren felt a strange warmth at her words, but before he could say anything, a loud horn blast echoed through the jungle. The trial was over. The next morning, Darren stood before King Vaylor, the royal court watching. Despite the traps, the assassins, and the monster that had chased him through the jungle, he had survived. Zyra, who had been skeptical from the start, stepped forward. "Fine, you survived the jungle. But that doesn't prove you're worthy." Velia raised an eyebrow. "He passed the king's test. That should be enough." Zyra crossed her arms. "Not for me." She turned to Darren, golden eyes gleaming with challenge. "Fight me. If you win, I'll accept you as worthy." The court gasped. Darren smirked. "You really hate this, don't you?" Zyra scowled. "I hate the idea of a weak human marrying the Exeltharian princess. If you want a place here, then prove you deserve it." Kane Vaylor leaned forward, watching closely. "Very well. A duel will be held in the arena." Lyrian looked uneasy, but Velia seemed curious. Darren rolled his shoulders. He had no choice now. He had to fight a trained warrior princess. The arena, later that day. The crowd gathered, excitement buzzing in the air. Thyra stood at the center of the arena, dressed in light combat armor, gripping her dual energy blades. Darren had been given a simple training sword. Nothing fancy, nothing powerful, just skill and instinct. The battle began. Zyra moved first, her speed blinding. Darren barely dodged as her blade sliced through the air. She wasn't just fast, she was dangerous. Darren blocked, countered, and used his agility to avoid lethal strikes. But Zyra was relentless, forcing him on the defensive. Then Darren saw an opening. He feinted left, then rolled right, knocking her off balance. Zyra's eyes widened as Darren pressed his blade to her throat. The arena fell silent. Then, to everyone's shock, Zyra smirked. Not bad, for a human. She stepped back and nodded in respect. Darren had won. The palace seemed peaceful as night fell. The faint hum of the city's energy core buzzed softly in the background, and the royal grounds glowed under the light of the twin moons. Darren, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His duel with Zyra earlier that day had changed things. She had finally nodded in respect after he bested her, but Darren knew she still didn't fully trust him. At least now, he wasn't seen as a complete outsider. Yet, a sense of unease lingered. As Darren prepared to rest in his quarters, he heard a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, Velia stood there, her face calm but her tone urgent. "We need to talk. Now." He let her in, closing the door behind her. "What's going on?" Velia looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You've passed every test so far, but there's still resistance. Some in the court refuse to accept a human in the royal family. I suspect there's a final plan to remove you." Darren crossed his arms. "Another assassination attempt?" Velia nodded. "Perhaps tonight. I overheard certain nobles speaking in hushed tones. If they can make your death look like an accident, they'll be free from the king's decree." Darren's jaw tightened. "And you're warning me because—" Velia raised an eyebrow. "Because logic says a united Seltharian human alliance benefits our empire. Also," she paused for a moment, "Lyrian would be devastated." Darren blinked. That last part caught him off guard, but he quickly refocused. "What should I do?" Vilia's voice was steady. "Be ready. Don't trust anyone tonight. Stay in your quarters, and if anything happens, call for help immediately." Darren nodded. "Understood." Late into the night, Darren couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the quiet hum of the palace. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint click near his window. He moved silently, picking up a small metal staff he found earlier. The shadow of a figure crept inside, quiet as a whisper. Darren's heart pounded, but his grip was steady. He waited until the intruder was fully inside before lunging. He swung the staff, catching the figure off guard. The intruder stumbled, dropping a small blade that glowed faintly in the dark. Darren didn't wait. He pressed forward, using his training and instinct. The two scuffled, but Darren had the upper hand. Within moments, he disarmed the assassin and pinned him against the wall. "Who sent you?" Darren growled. The assassin remained silent, but Darren noticed something on his uniform, a small insignia, one he'd seen earlier in the royal court. This wasn't just a hired killer. This was someone working from within the palace itself. Darren's suspicions were confirmed. The conspiracy was real, and it was closer than he had ever imagined. The royal court buzzed with tension as dawn approached. The sun cast pale light through the tall crystal windows of the throne room, illuminating the expectant faces of the gathered nobles. Darren, now standing before King Valar's throne once again, was bruised and tired from the night's events, but very much alive. He held his head high, despite the murmurs surrounding him. Darren's survival of yet another attempt on his life had proven more than just his physical endurance. It had demonstrated his determination to stand his ground, no matter what challenges or enemies lurked in the shadows. King Valar rose, his deep voice cutting through the whispers. "You have shown strength. You have shown resilience. Now you will make a decision that will shape the future of our kingdom." The entire hall fell silent as the king gestured to his daughters. Kalaira, her stance confident and sharp, regarded Darren with a look that bordered on respect. Velia, ever calm and calculating, watched him closely, as though studying his every move. Lyrian, on the other hand, stood quietly, her expression soft and unsure, but her eyes locked on Darren with unmistakable concern. The king continued, "You may choose one of my daughters to be your wife, and stand beside you in this alliance. If you find none to your liking, you may refuse, but know this, refusing would leave the Seltharian dominion and humanity's fragile unity at risk." Darren glanced at each princess. Khazura, once openly hostile, had come to respect his abilities. Velia, while initially distant, now saw potential in him. But it was Lyrian who had risked herself to warn him of the conspiracy. It was Lyrian who had shown him kindness when others treated him as an outsider. Still, Darren hesitated. This wasn't just about who he liked or admired. It was about the larger implications. A union with any of the princesses would mean taking on a leadership role he had never sought. It would mean working every day to bridge two entirely different worlds. The court waited in hushed anticipation. Even Xyra's usual impatience was absent as she stood tall, arms folded. Velia's expression remained neutral, though her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. Lyrian's gaze, warm and steady, held Darren's attention the longest. Darren cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, this decision isn't one I make lightly. Your daughters have each shown me their strength in their own way. I respect them all. But if I am to marry, I must choose someone who has already proven she can see past my origins and stand by me not out of duty, but because she believes in me." He turned to Lyrian. "I choose you, if you'll have me." Lyrian's eyes widened in surprise, but then she smiled. A genuine, soft smile. She nodded. "I will." The court erupted in a mix of cheers and whispers, but King Valor simply smiled, as if he had foreseen this outcome all along. "Then it is settled," the king declared. "The human, Darren Cole, has proven his worth and chosen his bride. Let this union mark a new era for the Seltharian dominion and humanity." And as Darren looked at Lyrian, he knew that this was just the beginning. A long journey lay ahead, but they would face it together. The royal celebration was in full swing. The union of Darren and Lyrian wasn't just a personal matter. It symbolized a new bond between Earth and the Seltharian dominion. Nobles mingled, raised glasses, and spoke in cautiously optimistic tones about the possibilities this alliance could bring. The towering crystal walls of the royal hall shimmered with soft light as music filled the air. Darren, however, felt uneasy. Even in the midst of celebration, he couldn't forget the attempts on his life and the looming shadow of conspiracy. He glanced at Lyrian, who was laughing softly at something Velia had said. Her silver eyes caught his, and she gave him a small smile. It was the first time he'd seen her so relaxed. But deep down, Darren knew that their troubles weren't over. His instincts proved correct when a loud alarm suddenly blared through the palace. The music stopped, and the crowd fell silent. Looking around in confusion, King Valor stood from his throne, his golden cloak catching the light. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. A royal guard rushed in, bowing quickly. "Your Majesty, a hostile fleet has entered Seltharian space. It's the Revarkians." Gasps filled the room. The Revarkians were a long-standing enemy, a rival alien empire known for their brutal tactics. For years, the Seltharian dominion and the Revarkians had maintained a tense truce, but it seemed that peace had finally shattered. The king's voice was calm but firm. "How many ships?" "Dozens, Your Majesty. They are heavily armed and moving toward our outer colonies." Darren stepped forward. "This can't be a coincidence. Someone inside your court must have known they were coming. Maybe they're the same people who sent the assassins after me." Velia, always sharp, nodded. "He's right. The timing is too perfect. They must have been waiting for this exact moment." Zira slammed her fist into her palm. "If they think they can intimidate us, they're dead wrong. I'll lead the fleet myself." "No," Valor said firmly. "If this is a trap, we can't send our best warriors into an ambush." The room grew tense as everyone waited for the king's decision. Darren watched as Lyrian stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "Father, let Darren help. He knows human tactics, strategies that the Revarkians may not expect." Darren blinked in surprise. "Me? You want me to lead your forces?" "You're not leading," Valor said, "but you may advise. Let's see if your human ingenuity is as valuable as Lyrian believes." Darren nodded. "All right. I'll do what I can." The room erupted into movement as the celebration turned into a war council. Darren and Lyrian exchanged a look. They were no longer just a couple trying to navigate a tricky political marriage. They were about to face a battle that could decide the future of two civilizations. Will Darren's human strategies be enough to counter the Revarkian fleet? And who within the court is pulling the strings behind the scenes? Part 10 coming soon. The Grand Command Chamber aboard the Seltharian flagship was alive with activity. Holographic displays lit up the room, projecting the incoming Revarkian fleet in eerie green outlines. Officers shouted commands, and the hum of the ship's power core resonated beneath the floor. Darren stood near the central console, a holographic map of the battlefield flickering in front of him. Beside him, Lyrian and Velia watched closely. Cain Vaylor had given Darren a chance to advise the fleet's defense, but he knew this wasn't just about strategy. It was a test of his ability to contribute something valuable to the Seltharian Dominion. If he failed, it wouldn't just be his reputation on the line. Thousands of lives were at stake. 3 waves of Revarkian ships incoming, an officer reported. They're targeting the outer colonies first. Darren studied the map. If we try to meet them head-on, we'll lose too many ships, he said. They're expecting us to defend in one place. Velia, ever the strategist, tilted her head. What are you suggesting? We need to split our forces, Darren explained. Send decoy ships here and here. He pointed to 2 sectors on the map. When the Revarkians attack the decoys, we hit them from the flanks with everything we've got. Lyrian spoke up. If it works, we could destroy their main assault force before it reaches our colonies. Velia nodded. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. Cain Vaylor's voice boomed over the comms. Proceed with the humans' plan. In the cold depths of space, the Seltharian fleet moved into position. Small decoy frigates veered into the designated sectors, broadcasting false signals to make them appear as larger targets. The Revarkians took the bait. Their massive warships surged toward the decoys, energy weapons charging. Hidden among asteroid fields and nebulae, the Seltharian main fleet waited. Darren watched the battle unfold from the command chamber. He held his breath as the Revarkian ships drew closer to the traps. Then the Seltharian ships sprang into action. From 2 sides, sleek battlecruisers and fighter squadrons swept in, catching the Revarkian forces off guard. The comms were filled with reports of enemy vessels taking heavy damage. The Seltharians' superior maneuvering and Darren's unexpected strategy gave them the upper hand. Lyrian stood at Darren's side, her silver eyes shining with hope. It's working. But Darren knew it wasn't over. He turned to Velia. What about their command ship? Velia's expression darkened. Still holding back. They're waiting for us to overcome it. Darren nodded. Then let's draw them out. He quickly adjusted the plan. A small strike team, led by Xyra, who had insisted on joining the fight, would attack the Revarkian command ship directly. The goal was to force their leader into the open, breaking the enemy's morale. Xyra's voice came through the comms. Engaging now. Don't screw this up, human. The battle reached its climax as Xyra's team breached the enemy command ship's defenses. Within minutes, the Revarkians began retreating. Their once imposing fleet scattered, and victory belonged to the Seltharians. Back aboard the flagship, Darren slumped into a chair, exhausted but relieved. Lyrian stood beside him, a soft smile on her face. You did it, she said quietly. You saved them. Darren shook his head. We all did it. I just pointed them in the right direction. Cain Vaylor's voice echoed through the chamber. Darren Cole, today you have proven that humanity and Seltharia together are stronger than apart. You have earned your place here. Darren met the king's gaze and nodded. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of something bigger, a future where humans and Seltharians could stand together, stronger than ever.